7 voices rose together during the midnight mass on Christmas Eve, 1868. Not in prayer, not in hymn, in something else entirely. A cascading surge of sound unlike anything ever heard inside that small Georgia chapel. The sounds did not resemble any known language. They did not follow familiar patterns of speech or song. They seemed wrong somehow, out of place, causing the congregation to freeze in their pews as candle flames trembled, as if the air itself had suddenly turned cold. The 7 who spoke were formerly enslaved people, freed only 3 years earlier. For months, they had attended services quietly. They caused no disturbances. They never drew attention to themselves until that night. What followed in the next several minutes would later be recorded by 3 separate witnesses: the minister, a town clerk, and physician. Each wrote accounts so similar they might have been copied from one another, though each swore they wrote independently. All 3 struggled to explain what they had witnessed. An event that would fracture the town, ruin reputations, and leave behind a mystery so deep that more than a century later, no one has been able to answer the most basic question. What did those 7 people actually say? The words, if they could even be called words, seemed to rise from somewhere ancient, somewhere long buried. They moved in rhythms that felt older than the chapel itself, older than the town, older than memory. And when the voices finally stopped, when silence returned to that candlelit room, something had shifted, something had been released, or perhaps something had been remembered. This is not a story about possession. This is not a story about miracles. This is a story about what happens when the past refuses to remain silent, when trauma finds its voice, when 7 people who have been stripped of everything, their freedom, their families, even their names, suddenly spoke in a language no one could silence. If you're drawn to mysteries history tried to bury, to stories where the truth always seems just beyond reach, you'll want to stay with us. Subscribe now and don't miss what comes next, because this story only becomes stranger. Valdosta, Georgia, in the winter of 1868, was a town still bleeding from the war. 3 years had passed since Appomattox, but the wounds ran deeper than anyone cared to admit. The streets were quieter than they once had been. Fewer men walked them. Fewer voices filled the air. The grand homes along Patterson Street stood like memorials to a vanished world. Paint peeling, gardens overgrown, windows dark. The war had taken sons, fathers, and fortunes. What it left behind was a fragile peace. A town trying to rebuild itself atop the bones of what it used to be. The cotton fields that had once made Valdosta prosperous now lay fallow, worked by men and women who were legally free, but economically trapped. The railroad depot, once alive with commerce and movement, now stood mostly empty, its wooden platforms weathered, its iron tracks rusting in places. And within that uneasy peace, the newly freed population, men, women, and children who had been considered property only years earlier, were forced to navigate a society that did not know what to do with them. The Freedmen's Bureau had opened a small office on the corner of Hill Avenue, housed in a plain building with a sagging porch. A tired northern agent named Mr. Charles Whitmore worked there, attempting to mediate disputes, register marriages, and help former slaves find employment. His resources were scarce. His authority was constantly questioned. His presence was quietly resented by much of the white population. Most of the freed people kept their heads down. Most worked the same land they always had, now under labor contracts that felt disturbingly close to the chains they had supposedly escaped. Most avoided trouble, avoided attention, avoided anything that might remind Valdosta's white residents that the old order was gone. But there were 7 who began attending services at the First Methodist Chapel on Ashley Street. 7 who sat silently in the back pews, still as stone, listening as Reverend Thaddeus Carver preached sermons about redemption and grace. 7 who had been invited, cautiously, by the Reverend himself, a man who believed, perhaps too earnestly, that the church should be open to every soul. Reverend Carver was 42 years old, thin, with graying hair and kind eyes that had witnessed too much suffering. He had served as a chaplain during the war, tending to wounded soldiers from both sides, and the experience had changed him. When he returned to Valdosta in 1866, he carried a firm conviction that the church needed to be a force for healing, reconciliation, and something better than the hatred still simmering beneath daily life. His decision to welcome freed slaves into the chapel had not been popular. Several families left the congregation in protest. Others remained but made their displeasure clear through cold stares and whispered complaints. Still, Carver persisted. He believed that if the church could not offer inclusion, it had no right to speak of Christian love. The 7 who accepted his invitation were recorded carefully in the church ledger. Their names were written in neat ink: Abigail, Marcus, Dinah, Samuel, Esther, Jonah, and Clea. Their ages ranged from 19 to 43. All had been enslaved on the same property, the old Harrow Plantation, 10 miles south of town. All had been freed amid the chaos of Sherman's march through Georgia in late 1864. All had remained nearby, working as laborers, washerwomen, and farmhands, taking whatever work they could find in a town that didn't want them, but depended on their labor. Abigail, the eldest at 43, had deep-set eyes and hands scarred from decades in the fields. She now worked as a washerwoman, taking in laundry from a few families willing to pay her. She lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of town, a structure that leaked in the rain and offered little protection from the winter cold. Marcus was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, his face marked by a long scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of a punishment he'd received years earlier for the crime of learning to read. He worked as a day laborer, hauling freight at the depot or repairing fences on nearby farms whenever someone was willing to hire him. Dinah was 26, quiet and observant, with a voice so soft people often had to lean closer to hear her. She worked as a domestic servant for a family on Patterson Street, cleaning their home, preparing meals, caring for their children. She slept in a small room behind their kitchen, barely large enough to hold a bed. Samuel was 31, a man who had apprenticed as a blacksmith before the war and still bore the burns and calluses of that trade. After emancipation, he had tried to open his own smithy, but no one would lend him money for tools or materials. Now he survived on odd jobs, repairing what he could with borrowed equipment. Esther was 22, the youngest woman among them, with a face that might have been beautiful if not for the haunted look that never left her eyes. She had been separated from her mother and siblings during the war and had never managed to find them again. She worked in the fields, picking what little cotton was still grown, her hands moving with a mechanical precision that suggested she no longer needed to think about the work. Jonah was 40, a man who had once served as a driver on the Harrow Plantation, a position that required him to enforce discipline among other enslaved people, a role that had left him isolated and mistrusted by those around him. Now he worked as a groundskeeper at the town cemetery, a job that kept him away from most people, which seemed to suit him just fine. And Clea was 19, the youngest of the 7, a girl born into slavery and freed before she fully understood what either word truly meant. She worked as a seamstress, mending clothes for anyone willing to pay, her fingers quick and precise despite the poor, flickering light inside her cabin. By all outward measures, they were unremarkable, quiet, respectful. They arrived early for services and left quickly once they ended. They spoke only when spoken to. They never sought attention. They always sat together in the back left corner of the chapel, a space that had become theirs through unspoken agreement. And they listened to Reverend Carver's sermons with expressions that revealed nothing. Nothing, that is, until Christmas Eve, 1868. The days leading up to Christmas had been unusually cold. A hard frost settled over Valdosta, turning the ground iron hard and coating bare tree branches with a thin glaze of ice that glittered under the weak winter sun. The town made an effort to celebrate. Wreaths appeared on doors. Candles flickered in windows. The general store displayed a handful of modest toys and ribbons, but the cheer felt forced, like a performance of normalcy in a place still haunted by loss. Reverend Carver spent the week preparing for the Christmas Eve service. He decorated the chapel with pine branches and holly, their sharp, clean scent filling the small space and offering a reminder of life even in the depths of winter. He rehearsed his sermon carefully, choosing each word with intention, determined to speak of hope without dismissing the pain so many in his congregation still carried. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, he visited each of the 7, as was his habit. He brought small gifts, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a warm scarf, and wished each of them a blessed Christmas. They thanked him quietly, their gratitude sincere but restrained, as if kindness was something they had learned not to expect and were still learning how to receive. None of them showed any sign that something unusual was about to happen. The chapel was full that night. Nearly every pew was occupied. Families sat close together, their breath visible in the cold air despite the small stove burning in the corner. Candles lined the windowsills, their flames casting long shadows across the wooden pews, making the space feel both intimate and strangely vast. The air smelled of pine and wax, mixed with a faint musk of wool coats damp from the evening drizzle. Reverend Carver stood at the pulpit, his voice steady and warm as he spoke of nativity, of hope born in the darkest season, of light breaking through the gloom. He spoke of Mary and Joseph, of their journey, of faith sustained in uncertainty. He spoke of the shepherds, of how the divine revelation came first to the lowliest, to those society had overlooked. His words were carefully chosen, meant to comfort, to inspire, to remind his congregation that even in their darkest moments, they were not forgotten. The congregation listened. Some bowed their heads. Others closed their eyes. A few watched with quiet skepticism. The 7 sat in their usual place in the back left corner. They wore their best clothes, clean but worn, mended in places too thin to keep out the cold. Abigail draped a dark shawl over her shoulders. Marcus sat with his hands folded in his lap, his scarred face unreadable. Dinah stared at the floor. Samuel's jaw was clenched, as if he were holding something inside. Esther's gaze was distant, unfocused. Jonah sat unnaturally still, barely breathing. Clea's hands trembled slightly, though whether from the cold or something else, no one could say. It was just past midnight when it began. The church clock, an old piece mounted on the wall near the pulpit, chimed 12 times. Each strike echoed through the chapel, lingering in the air longer than it should have. Reverend Carver paused mid-sermon, waiting for the chimes to fade, a small smile crossing his face as if acknowledging the arrival of Christmas Day. And then Abigail stood. There was no warning. One moment she was seated, silent and still. The next, she was on her feet, her body rigid, her hands gripping the pew in front of her with such force that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on something no one else could perceive. Her mouth opened and sound poured out. It was not English. It was not any language recognized by anyone in that chapel. It was a string of guttural rhythmic syllables, rising and falling in a cadence that felt almost musical, yet entirely alien. The sound seemed to come from deep within her, as though something long buried had finally forced its way to the surface. Amakosi NYUSFO. The congregation turned, startled and confused. A few people half rose from their seats, unsure whether to approach or flee. Reverend Carver stopped mid-sentence. His hand lifted as if to quiet her, the color draining from his face. Before anyone could react, Marcus stood beside her. His movement was just as sudden, just as mechanical. His mouth opened and the same sounds emerged, his voice deeper, but perfectly synchronized with Abigail's. Then Dinah stood, then Samuel, then Esther, then Jonah, then Clea. One by one, all 7 rose to their feet, their voices merging into a single chorus that filled the chapel with sound no one there had ever heard before. It was not chaotic. It was not random. It was precise, perfectly coordinated, as if they were reciting something memorized long ago, as if the words, if they were words at all, had been waiting inside them dormant until this exact moment. The rhythm was hypnotic, relentless. The syllables repeated and shifted, forming. patterns that felt deliberate and structured, like a chant or a prayer, or perhaps an invocation. The seven spoke in flawless unison, their voices overlapping and weaving together, creating harmonics that seemed to vibrate to the chapel walls, the wooden floor, even the air itself. The congregation remained frozen. Some would later insist it was a language. Others claimed it was meaningless noise, random syllables without sense. But everyone agreed on one point. It was synchronized. The seven spoke as a single entity, their voices rising and falling together, their breathing aligned, their timing impossibly precise. Reverend Carver tried to speak, to call out to them, but his voice failed him. A heavy pressure settled in his chest, making it difficult to draw breath. The candles along the windowsills flickered wildly, their flames bending as if pushed by an unseen wind, though the air inside the chapel was perfectly still. A woman in the third row screamed. The sound shattered the momentary paralysis, and several people surged to their feet, pushing toward the exits. Yet most remained rooted where they sat, unable to move, unable to look away from the seven figures standing at the back of the chapel, their faces empty, their eyes unfocused, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization. The chant continued for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in that frozen space. The syllables grew louder, more urgent, building to a crescendo that seemed to fill every corner of the chapel, pressing against the walls, the ceiling, the bodies huddled in the pews. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The seven sat down at the exact same moment, their movements smooth and coordinated, as though guided by a single will. Their faces remained blank, their eyes distant, as if they were waking from a dream. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. It was broken only by the sound of someone sobbing quietly in the front row. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The candles continued to flicker, their flames slowly steadying. The smell of wax and pine suddenly felt overwhelming, cloying in the stillness. Then a woman screamed again, louder this time, and the spell broke. People rushed toward the doors, shoving and stumbling, their faces twisted with fear and confusion. Within minutes, the chapel was nearly empty, families spilling out into the cold night, their Christmas observance utterly forgotten. Only a small group remained. Reverend Carver stood frozen at the pulpit, his face pale, his hands trembling. Dr. Horace Langford, the town physician, a 50-year-old man with silvering hair and a reputation for calm rationality. Mr. Edmund Tate, the town clerk, a meticulous man in his 30s who never went anywhere without a notebook. And Mr. Silas Brennan, a church deacon in his 60s, a stern man who had fought in the war and took pride in his unshakable composure. And the seven themselves, still seated in the back pew, their expressions blank, their breathing steady, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Dr. Langford was the first to move. He approached slowly, cautiously, like a man nearing a wounded animal. He knelt beside Abigail and gently took her wrist, checking her pulse. It was steady, normal. He examined her eyes for signs of distress or illness. Her pupils reacted normally. He spoke to her softly. "Abigail, can you hear me?" She blinked slowly, as though waking from a deep sleep. Her eyes focused on him, confusion written across her face. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. "I can hear you. Do you know where you are?" "In the chapel, sir." "Do you know what just happened?" She stared at him, her confusion deepening. "No, sir. I don't remember. We were listening to the Reverend's sermon, and then her voice trailed off as she frowned. "I don't remember. Doctor." Dr. Langford moved from Marcus to Dinah, then to each of the others in turn, asking the same questions, performing the same examinations. Their pulses were normal. Their breathing was calm. Their eyes were clear. None showed any sign of illness, intoxication, or deceit. And none of them remembered standing. None remembered speaking. None remembered anything after Reverend Carver began his sermon. Throughout the incident, Edmund Tate had been taking notes. His hand moved rapidly across the pages of his notebook, recording every detail he could observe. He wrote down phonetic approximations of the sounds the seven had produced, attempting to capture the rhythm, the structure, the patterns he had heard. Silas Brennan stood near the door, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had witnessed many things during the war, things that had tested his faith, his sanity, his understanding of the world. But this was different. This was something he could not categorize, something that resisted explanation. Reverend Carver finally found his voice. He stepped down from the pulpit and approached the seven, his expression a mix of concern and bewilderment. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Do any of you feel ill? Do you need anything?" They shook their heads, their confusion obvious. Abigail spoke for them, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're sorry, Reverend. We don't know what happened. We didn't mean to disrupt the service." "You didn't disrupt anything," Carver replied, though the words rang hollow even to him. "I just want to be sure you're all right." They assured him they were, though their eyes told a different story. They were frightened, unsettled, unsure what had taken place. Gathering their coats and scarves, they moved slowly, as if their bodies did not entirely belong to them, and left the chapel together, disappearing into the cold night. The four men who remained stood in silence for a long while, each lost in his own thoughts, trying to understand what they had witnessed. Finally, Dr. Langford spoke. "I've never seen anything like that." "Nor have I," Tate said quietly, glancing down at his notes. "But whatever it wasn't random. There was structure to it, pattern, intention." "Intention?" Brennan said sharply. "You think they planned this?" "I don't know what I think," Tate admitted, "but I know what I heard, and what I heard wasn't chaos. It was organized." Reverend Carver sank into a pew, burying his face in his hands. "What are we going to tell people?" he asked. "What are we going to say happened here tonight?" No one had an answer. By morning, the entire town knew. Stories spread like wildfire, exaggerated and distorted, each retelling adding new details with every repetition. Some claimed the seven had spoken in the voice of the devil. Others insisted they had been overtaken by the spirits of the dead. A few whispered that it was a curse, a reckoning for the sins of the town, for the sins of slavery, for the sins of the war itself. Mrs. Adelaide Hutchkins, a widow who lived on Patterson Street and had been present in the chapel that night, told her neighbors she had seen the seven's eyes turn completely white, that their voices sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once, that the temperature inside the chapel had dropped so suddenly she could see her breath. Mr. Jeremiah Cole, a shopkeeper who had fled in the first wave of panic, swore he had heard drums beneath the chanting, a deep, rhythmic pounding that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Miss Harriet Dawson, a schoolteacher known for her rational mind, confessed to her sister that she had felt something in the chapel that night, a presence, a weight that made her skin crawl and her heart race. With each telling, the stories grew more extreme. By noon on Christmas Day, half the town was convinced that something demonic had taken place inside the First Methodist Chapel. Reverend Carver attempted to calm the rising hysteria. 2 days after Christmas, he called for a town meeting, standing before a packed room inside the courthouse, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. He had spent the previous 2 days visiting families, trying to reassure them, trying to explain the events in rational terms. But his own uncertainty seeped into every word. "What we witnessed," he said carefully, "was unusual. I won't deny that, but I do not believe it was evil. I believe it was a manifestation of grief, of trauma, of something we do not yet understand." His words did little to quiet the crowd. A man in the back, Thomas Ridley, a farmer who had lost 2 sons in the war, shouted that the seven should be driven out of town, that they were dangerous, that their presence was an affront to decent Christian people. A woman, Mrs. Beatrice Harmon, whose husband had been killed at Gettysburg, demanded they be examined by a priest, that someone with proper spiritual authority determine whether they had been possessed. Another voice, belonging to Mr. Nathaniel Cross, a merchant who had prospered during the war by selling supplies to both sides, called for the 7 to be locked up, quarantined, kept away from the rest of the population until it could be determined what happened to them. Dr. Langford stood next, a man of science, respected throughout the community. His words carried weight. He had served as a surgeon during the war, had seen men die from wounds that should have been survivable, had seen others live through injuries that should have been fatal. He had learned to trust observation over superstition, evidence over fear. I examined each of them immediately after the incident, he said, his tone calm and deliberate. I found no signs of illness, no intoxication, no deception. Their vital signs were normal. Their mental faculties appeared intact. Whatever occurred, they were not in control of it. I believe it was a form of hysteria, a psychological phenomenon brought on by stress or fear. Even as he spoke, doubt flickered behind his eyes. He had witnessed hysteria before during the war, had seen men break under the strain of battle, seen them weep uncontrollably, scream in terror, lose the ability to speak or move. But this had been different. Hysteria was individual, chaotic, unpredictable. What he had seen in the chapel had been collective, synchronized, structured. Edmund Tate, the town clerk, was the last to speak. He was a meticulous man, known for his attention to detail, for his ability to organize information and detect patterns where others saw only confusion. He had taken notes during the event, recording everything he could, and had spent the past 2 days reviewing them, searching for meaning. He read them aloud now, his voice flat and clinical, as though presenting evidence in a courtroom. The sounds followed a pattern, he said. Repetitive syllables, consistent rhythm, no deviation. The 7 spoke in perfect unison, their timing synchronized to within a fraction of a second. The syllables formed clusters, groups of 3 or 4 sounds, that repeated with variation. It was not random. It was structured. Structured how? Someone called from the crowd. Tate hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Like a language, the room erupted. Voices overlapped. Accusations flew. Fear hardened into anger. Some demanded the 7 be questioned, interrogated, forced to explain what they had said and why. Others insisted they be expelled from town immediately, sent away before they could bring further harm. A few voices, quieter, hesitant, suggested that perhaps they should be left alone, that perhaps what had happened was not their fault. Reverend Carver tried to restore order, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The town had decided. The 7 were dangerous. The 7 were a threat. The 7 had to be dealt with. The meeting ended in chaos. No resolution, no plan, only fear, anger, and confusion. The 7 were not arrested. There was no law against what they had done, no crime that could be named. But they were shunned. Employers refused to hire them. Neighbors stopped speaking to them. Shopkeepers denied them service. They became ghosts within their own town, unwanted, unseen, moving to the streets like shadows. Their presence acknowledged only through averted eyes and whispered conversations. Abigail lost her laundry clients. Marcus was turned away from the depot when he showed up looking for work. Dinah was dismissed from her position as a domestic servant, told her services were no longer needed. Samuel found that no one would hire him for repairs or labor. Esther was told not to return to the fields. Jonah was informed that the cemetery no longer required his services. Clea's sewing clients stopped coming to her cabin altogether. Within a week, they were destitute, surviving on what little they had saved and on the charity of the few who were willing to help them. Mostly other freed people, those who understood what it meant to be cast out, to be blamed for things beyond their control. Reverend Carver tried to intervene. He visited the 7, bringing them food and offering whatever support he could manage. He spoke to members of his congregation, pleading with them to show compassion, to remember Christ's teachings, to understand that fear was not a justification for cruelty. But his appeals fell on deaf ears. Attendance at services dwindled. Families who had worshiped there for years stopped coming. Donations declined. Anonymous letters began to arrive. some openly threatening, others expressing disappointment that he would defend those people. Slowly, Carver realized how precarious his position in the community had become, how his insistence on treating the seven with dignity was costing him the respect and support of those he had served for years. Still, he could not let it go. He could not accept that what had happened in the chapel was merely hysteria or coincidence. He had seen the expressions on their faces. He had heard the sound they produced. He had felt something in that moment. Something he could not name, something that resisted explanation. He began to investigate quietly, carefully, speaking to anyone who might offer insight. This is a kind of story that refuses to let go. If you're drawn to mysteries like this, stories that challenge what we think we know, take a moment to show your support and let us know you're here. It helps keep the forgotten histories alive. In the weeks that followed, Reverend Carver became consumed by the mystery. Sleep eluded him. Night after night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom, replaying the events of Christmas Eve, searching for meaning, for some thread he might have missed. He continued his investigation methodically, beginning with the seven themselves. He visited each of them in their homes, small, drafty cabins on the edge of town that offered little protection from the winter cold. He brought food, blankets, whatever he could spare, and he asked them about their past, their experiences, their memories. At first, they were hesitant. They had learned long ago that speaking too freely could be dangerous, that revealing too much could be turned against them. But Carver was patient, gentle, persistent. He assured them he was not there to judge or accuse, only to understand. Gradually, over many visits, they began to open up. What he learned deeply unsettled him. All seven had been on the Harrow plantation during the final months of the war. All seven had witnessed the same event, the death of Nathaniel Harrow, the plantation owner, in December of 1864. Harrow had been a brutal man, even by the standards of his time. He was known throughout the county for his cruelty, his volatile temper, and his readiness to inflict punishment for the smallest perceived offense. He had inherited the plantation from his father in 1850 and ruled it with an iron hand, believing fear to be the only effective means of control. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall, with a thick beard and cold gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. His presence alone inspired terror. When he walked through the corridors, conversation ceased. When he entered a room, eyes dropped to the floor. But in the days leading up to Sherman's arrival, something in him had shifted. He became erratic and deeply paranoid, convinced the enslaved people were plotting against him. He began carrying a pistol at all times. Guards were posted around his house at night. He interrogated people at random, demanding to know what they were planning, what they were hiding. On December 20th, 1864, he gathered everyone in the barn, more than 30 people, and forced them to witness an execution. The man was named Elijah, one of the oldest and most respected members of the enslaved community. Elijah was 63 years old, born into slavery, and had spent his entire life on the Harrow plantation. He was a leader among the others, a man people turned to for advice, for comfort, for guidance. He was known for his quiet dignity, his refusal to be broken, his ability to maintain hope even in the darkest circumstances. According to those who witnessed it, Harrow's reason for killing him was simple. He had caught Elijah praying. Late one night, Harrow burst into Elijah's cabin with 2 overseers and found him kneeling on the floor, hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer. Harrow flew into a rage, accusing Elijah of witchcraft, of trying to curse him, of conspiring with the others to bring about his downfall. Elijah tried to explain that he was only praying, that he meant no harm, that he was asking God for strength and guidance. Harrow would not listen. He dragged Elijah from the cabin, through the quarters, and into the barn. He forced everyone to gather and watch. He made Elijah kneel in the dirt at the center of the barn, surrounded by the people he had lived with, worked beside, and prayed alongside for decades. Then Harrow raised his pistol and shot him in the head. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the barn, through the quarters, through the night. Elijah collapsed forward, his body crumpling as blood pooled beneath him. No one moved. No one made a sound. They stood frozen as Haro holstered his pistol and turned to face them. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice cold and flat. "Your prayers mean nothing here. Your God has no power here. I am the only authority you need to fear." Then he left the barn, ordering the overseers to ensure everyone returned to their cabins and remained there until morning. 3 days later, Nathaniel Haro was found dead in his study. The official cause was a heart attack. Dr. Langford, who examined the body, noted that Haro was overweight, drank heavily, and showed signs of chronic stress, conditions that made a heart attack plausible. But there were whispers that never appeared in any official record, that his body had been found in a strange position, that his mouth was open, his eyes wide, as though he had been trying to scream, that his face had been frozen in an expression of pure terror, that there had been no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, nothing to explain why a man who had been alive and apparently healthy only hours earlier was suddenly dead. The whispers hinted that perhaps Elijah's prayers had not been as powerless as Haro believed, that perhaps forces were at work which Haro neither understood, nor respected, nor feared enough. But they were only whispers, easily dismissed, easily buried amid the chaos that followed. Sherman's army arrived 2 days after Haro's death, and the plantation was abandoned. The enslaved population was freed and scattered, some heading north, others remaining in the area, attempting to build new lives from the ruins of the old. Reverend Carver pressed the 7 for more information. Had they been present when Haro died? Had they seen anything unusual? Heard anything? Felt anything that might explain what happened? Their answers were all the same. They did not remember. The days following Elijah's execution were a blur. They remembered the killing. They remembered the terror, the grief, the helplessness. They remembered Sherman's soldiers arriving. They remembered being told they were free. But the time in between was gone, erased, as though their minds had chosen not to hold it. Carver did not believe in coincidence. He began to suspect that whatever had occurred on Christmas Eve was connected to that night in 1864. But why now? And how? For years later, he resolved to visit the old Haro plantation himself, hoping to find some clue, some fragment of evidence that might bring understanding. The plantation lay 10 miles south of Valdosta, reached by a rutted dirt road winding through pine forests and abandoned fields. Carver borrowed a horse from a parishioner and rode out on a cold afternoon in late January, the sky heavy and gray with the promise of rain. The plantation house had burned during Sherman's march, leaving behind a blackened skeleton, walls crumbling, floors rotted through. The barn where Elijah had been executed still stood, though part of its roof had collapsed and its doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. The quarters, small cabins where the enslaved people had once lived, were mostly gone, reclaimed by the forest that would scavenge for fire or building. Carver dismounted and walked slowly through the ruins, his boots crunching over frozen ground. The place felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory, by the weight of suffering that had taken place there, by the lives lived and lost on that soil. He made his way toward what remained of the main house, stepping carefully over fallen beams and rubble. Haro's study was still partially intact, its walls scorched with standing, its floor littered with debris. Carver searched through the wreckage, sifting charred papers and broken furniture. He was about to give up when he found it. A leather-bound journal, burned around the edges but still readable, wedged beneath a fallen beam. The journal belonged to Nathaniel Haro. Its entries were erratic and paranoid, filled with rants about betrayal and conspiracy. Haro wrote obsessively about the enslaved people, about his belief that they were plotting against him, that they were practicing some form of dark magic meant to curse him and bring about his downfall. But one entry, dated December 19th, 1864, the day before Elijah's execution, stood out. "They think I don't know. They think I don't hear them, but I do. Every night in the quarters they gather. They speak in their heathen tongue, the one the old man taught them. Elijah leads them. He thinks he can curse me. He thinks his words have power. Tomorrow I will show him how powerless he truly is. Carver's hands trembled as he read. The old man. Who was the old man? He tucked the journal inside his coat and rode back toward Valdosta, his mind racing. That evening, he visited the seven again, this time with a specific question. Who was the old man, he asked. The one Haro wrote about. The one who taught you a language. At first, they said nothing, their expressions guarded. Then Abigail spoke. His name was Kofi, she said softly, barely above a whisper. He was brought over on a slave ship when he was a boy. He was the oldest among us. He remembered things, stories, songs, words from his homeland. He taught us not to curse anyone, to remember, to hold on to something that was ours. What happened to him? Carver asked. He died, Abigail replied, tears filling her eyes. 2 weeks before Elijah, Haro worked him to death in the fields. He was old, too old for that kind of labor, but Haro didn't care. Kofi collapsed one day and never got back up. Carver felt the pieces beginning to fit together. Kofi had taught them fragments of a language from his homeland. Elijah had used it to lead prayers that gave the enslaved community something Haro could not take away, something that belonged only to them. And when Haro killed Elijah, he believed he was erasing that final act of resistance, silencing the last voice of defiance. But he had failed. What were you saying that night? Carver asked quietly. On Christmas Eve. Do you know? Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with something he could not name, grief, longing, perhaps something deeper still. We don't remember speaking, she said. But if we did, maybe we were finishing what Elijah started. Maybe we were saying the prayer he never got to finish. Meanwhile, Dr. Langford had begun his own inquiry, a man of science, trained to observe, analyze, and seek rational explanations. He refused to accept that what he had witnessed defied understanding. He began by researching cases of glossolalia, speaking in tongues, a phenomenon recorded in religious context for centuries. He wrote to colleagues in Atlanta, in Charleston, in Richmond, asking whether they had encountered similar cases, whether they had any insight into what might cause such an event. The responses varied. Some dismissed it as hysteria, a psychological response to stress or trauma. Others suggested it might be a form of epilepsy, a neurological condition capable of producing involuntary vocalizations. A few mentioned religious ecstasy, instances where individuals claimed to speak divine languages. Though such cases were typically isolated and spontaneous, not collective or synchronized. But the more he read, the less convinced he became that this was a simple case of religious ecstasy or psychological disorder. Glossolalia was typically spontaneous, individual, and incoherent. What he had witnessed was synchronized, collective, and structured. He began to suspect that something else was at work, something that could not be explained by existing medical or psychological theories. Langford reached out to a colleague at the University of Virginia, a linguistics professor named Dr. Alastair Finch. Finch specialized in indigenous languages, African dialects, and obscure linguistic phenomena. In a detailed letter, Langford described the events of Christmas Eve and asked whether Finch had ever encountered anything similar, or whether he had any insight into what the seven might have been saying. Finch's reply arrived 3 weeks later. It was brief, almost curt. Did anyone record what they said? Langford felt a sinking sensation as he read it. No one had. The event had been so shocking, so unexpected, that no one had thought to document it in the moment. All that remained were memories, and memories, Langford knew, were unreliable, vulnerable to distortion, embellishment, and the influence of fear. He turned to Edmund Tate, the town clerk, hoping that Tate's meticulous habits might offer something more concrete. Tate showed him the pages he had written that night, sheets filled with phonetic approximations, careful attempts to capture the sounds the seven had produced. Langford copied the notes meticulously, transcribing them into his own hand, and sent them to Dr. Finch. Another 3 weeks passed before Finch responded. This letter was longer, more detailed, and far more unsettling. I cannot identify the language with certainty. Finch wrote, "The phonetic structure does not correspond to any known dialect I have encountered in my research. However, the pattern suggests intentionality. The syllables form clusters, and those clusters repeat with variation, hallmarks of language rather than random vocalization. This was not gibberish. This was not hysteria. Someone taught them this. The question is, who and why?" A chill ran down Langford's spine. Someone taught them this. Who could have taught them a language no one recognized? A language that appeared in no linguistic record. A language that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Langford shared Finch's letter with Reverend Carver, and the two men met in Carver's study to compare findings. Carver showed Langford the journal he had recovered from the Harrow plantation. Together, they pieced together the story of Kofi, of Elijah, of the prayers that had been silenced and the resistance that had been crushed. But why now? Langford asked, why did this happen 4 years after Elijah's death? Why on Christmas Eve? Carver didn't have a definitive answer, but he had a theory. Trauma doesn't disappear, he said slowly. It stays with us, buried, waiting. Maybe what happened on Christmas Eve was a release. Maybe the seven had been carrying this for years, and something about that night, the setting, the time, the atmosphere, triggered it. Maybe they were finally able to express what they'd been holding inside. Langford considered this. It was plausible. He had seen soldiers return from war carrying invisible wounds, memories that haunted them, experiences they could not articulate. He had treated men who woke screaming from nightmares, who flinched at sudden sounds, who struggled to re-enter civilian life. But this felt different. This was not individual trauma. It was collective, and it was synchronized. There's something else, Carver said, pulling another page from Harrow's journal. Listen to this. He read aloud an entry dated December 22nd, 1864, the day after Elijah's execution. I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them. The words, the sounds, they echo in my mind. Relentless, maddening. I see Elijah's face, his eyes, the way he looked at me before I pulled the trigger. There was no fear in his eyes, only certainty, as if he knew something I didn't, as if he had won, even in death. Carver looked up at Langford. Harrow was haunted by what he'd done. He couldn't escape it. Maybe the seven are haunted too. Maybe they're carrying not just their own trauma, but Elijah's, Kofi's, everyone who suffered on that plantation. Langford nodded slowly. It was compelling theory, but it still did not explain the precision, the structure, the flawless synchronization of what had occurred. We need to speak with Dr. Finch in person, Langford said. We need him here to interview the seven, to analyze this properly. If anyone can make sense of it, it's him. Carver agreed. Langford sent another letter to Finch, this one urgent, requesting that he travel to Valdosta. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived in Valdosta in early February, traveling by train from Virginia. He was a man in his 50s, tall, thin, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to absorb every detail at once. He carried a leather satchel filled with books, notebooks, and recording equipment, including a phonograph he hoped might capture the sounds if the seven could be induced to speak again. Langford and Carver met him at the depot and brought him to Carver's home, where they spent the evening discussing the case, sharing their findings, and planning their approach. Finch was skeptical at first. He had encountered many alleged linguistic phenomena that turned out to be hysteria or fraud. But as he reviewed Tate's notes, as he read Harrow's journal, as he listened to Carver and Langford recount what they had witnessed, his skepticism began to waver. This is extraordinary, he said finally. If what you're describing is accurate, this could be one of the most significant linguistic discoveries of the century, a language preserved through oral tradition, passed down among enslaved people, hidden from their oppressors. It's remarkable. The following day, Finch began his interviews. He met with each of the seven individually, asking about their memories, their experiences, their knowledge of Kofi and the language he had taught them. The process was slow and painstaking. The 7 were wary of the stranger who asked so many questions, who showed such intense interest in things they had tried to forget. But Finch was patient, gentle, and respectful. He explained that he was not there to judge or exploit them, only to understand. Gradually, over several days, they began to open up. Abigail remembered Kofi teaching them songs, simple melodies paired with words that sounded unlike anything she had ever heard before. She remembered how Kofi's voice would soften when he sang, how his eyes would close as if he were no longer there, as if his mind had traveled somewhere far away. Marcus remembered Kofi telling stories of his homeland, of the people he had left behind, of the life he had been torn from. He remembered the sadness in Kofi's voice, the longing that never fully faded, the grief that lingered beneath every word. Dinah remembered Kofi teaching them words, simple phrases, greetings, blessings, prayers. She remembered practicing them in secret, whispering them to herself late at night, holding on to those sounds like precious treasures. Samuel remembered Kofi's insistence that they remember, that they never allow the language to die, that they pass it down to their children and their children's children. He remembered Kofi saying that as long as they remembered, they would never truly be lost. Esther remembered how Elijah took over after Kofi died, leading them in prayers using the words Kofi had taught. She remembered the comfort those prayers brought, the sense of connection, the feeling that they belonged to something larger than themselves. Jonah remembered Harold's rage when he discovered what they were doing, the fear that swept through the quarters, the certainty that they were being watched, that any mistake could be fatal. Clea, the youngest, remembered very little. She had been only 15 when Elijah was killed, and the trauma of that night had blurred much of her memory. But she remembered the sound of the gunshot, the sight of Elijah's body, and the silence that followed. Finch took meticulous notes, recording everything they said, asking careful follow-up questions, gently probing for detail. He asked them to recall any words or phrases they remembered, any sounds or syllables Kofi had taught them. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to assemble fragments. The language, he concluded, likely originated from a region in what is now Ghana, possibly Kan or Jay, though certain elements did not fully align, suggesting either a lesser-known dialect or a creolized form shaped over generations. He asked whether they would be willing to try speaking the language again, to see if they could recall what they had spoken on Christmas Eve. They were reluctant, frightened by the idea, but Finch assured them he would be present, that Carver and Langford would be there as well, that they would be safe. On a cold afternoon in mid-February, the 7 gathered in Carver's study. Finch set up his phonograph, adjusting the horn and preparing the wax cylinder meant to capture their voices. Carver and Langford sat quietly to one side, watching, waiting. Finch asked the 7 to close their eyes, to relax, to remember Christmas Eve. He asked them to recall the feeling, the atmosphere, the moment they had stood and spoken. For a long while, nothing happened. They sat in silence, eyes closed, breathing steady. Then, slowly, Abigail began to speak. Her voice was soft at first, hesitant, as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Then the words came, the same syllables, the same rhythm, the same cadence that filled the chapel on Christmas Eve. Amakosi Nyamio. One by one, the others joined her. Their voices overlapped and intertwined, creating the same harmonics, the same patterns. It was quieter than it had been in the chapel, less overwhelming, but unmistakable. Finch's eyes widened. He leaned forward, listening intently, his pen moving quickly as he captured every sound, every nuance. The chant lasted nearly a minute, then slowly faded, the voices trailing off until silence returned. The 7 opened their eyes. They looked at one another, then at Finch, at Carver, at Langford. They appeared exhausted, drained, as if the act of speaking had taken something from them. Finch played back the recording, the scratchy sound of their voices emerging from the phonograph's horn. He listened closely, comparing it with Tate's notes, with his own transcriptions, with the linguistic patterns he had identified. At last, he looked up, his expression a mix of awe and uncertainty. "I believe," he said slowly, "that what you spoke was a prayer of remembrance." He explained that the words were fragmentary and incomplete, but the structure suggested a plea to ancestors, to those who had passed, asking not to be forgotten. The word Amakosi might be a variation of Nkosi, meaning chief or ancestor in some West African languages. Nyamadu could be related to Nyam, the supreme deity in Akan cosmology. Asfo might derive from a word meaning thanks or gratitude. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If my interpretation is correct, what you were saying was something like, 'Ancestors, divine spirits, we give thanks. We are not forgotten. We are not lost. We are here.'" The room fell silent. Tears pricked at Carver's eyes. Langford leaned back, deep in thought. The seven exchanged looks, something unspoken passing between them. Recognition, perhaps, or relief, or a sense of completion. "It was not a curse," Finch said softly. "It was not possession. It was a declaration, a refusal to be erased, a way of honoring those who were silenced." When Finch presented his findings to the town, the response was subdued. He delivered a public lecture at the courthouse, standing before a smaller crowd than the one that had gathered after Christmas. Many had already decided what they believed, and no amount of linguistic analysis would change their minds. Some accepted Finch's explanation. They were relieved to have a rational account, something that did not involve demons, curses, or supernatural forces. They were willing to believe that the seven had carried deep trauma, that they had found a way to express it, that what occurred was a psychological and cultural phenomenon rather than something malevolent. Others refused to accept it. They clung to belief that something supernatural had taken place, that the seven were possessed or cursed, that they were dangerous and should be avoided. Those people continued to ostracize the seven, continue to deny them work, continue to treat them as something to be feared. Assistants continued to treat them as pariahs. A few, very few, were moved by Finch's explanation. They began to see the seven not as threats, but as survivors, as people who had endured unimaginable suffering and had found a way to honor those who had been lost. These individuals reached out cautiously, offering work, offering help, offering a measured dignity that had long been denied. Reverend Carver continued to hold services at the chapel. The seven continued to attend, sitting in the back pews, silent and still. Over time, the congregation slowly began to grow again, though it never returned to its former size. Some families came back, drawn by Carver's persistence, by his refusal to abandon the seven, by his insistence that the church should be a place of compassion rather than judgment. Dr. Langford wrote a detailed account of the case and submitted it to a medical journal. It was published several months later and sparked debate among physicians and psychologists about trauma, memory, and collective experience. Some praised his work as groundbreaking. Others dismissed it as speculative. Still, it remained in the medical literature, a strange and unsettling footnote in the history of psychological phenomena. Dr. Finch returned to Virginia, taking with him the recordings and his notes. He continued to study the language fragments, corresponded with scholars in Europe and Africa, attempting to trace the origins of the words the seven had spoken. He never arrived at a definitive conclusion, but his work contributed to a growing understanding of the linguistic and cultural heritage carried by enslaved Africans in America. The seven slowly rebuilt their lives. It was not easy. The shadow of what had happened on Christmas Eve never fully lifted, but they found work. They found community among other freed people. They found ways to survive in a world that did not want them, yet could not function without them. Abigail continued taking in laundry, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, her thoughts often drifting to memories of Kofi, of Elijah, of the words that had been passed down to her. She never spoke them again aloud, but she remembered them, kept them close, a private treasure that no one could take away. Marcus found work at a sawmill. His strength and skill made him valuable despite the town's prejudice. He saved what little he could, dreaming of one day owning land of his own, of building something that would endure. Dinah found employment with a Quaker family who had moved to Valdosta after the war. They treated her with respect, paid her fairly, and never asked about Christmas Eve. She was grateful for their kindness, for the sense of normalcy they provided. Samuel eventually gathered enough money to purchase a few tools and set up a small smithy on the edge of town. Business was slow at first, but gradually people began to come, drawn by his skill and his fair prices. Esther married a man from a neighboring town, a freed slave who worked as a carpenter. Together they left Valdosta, seeking a new beginning in a place where no one knew their past. Jonah continued working at the cemetery, finding comfort in the quiet, among the dead who asked nothing of him and judged him not at all. Cleo continued to sew, her fingers quick and precise. Those who could see past the events of Christmas Eve came to value her work, recognizing the care and artistry she brought to every garment. They remained connected. The seven, bound by what they had experienced, by what they had spoken, by the memory of those who had been lost. On rare occasions, they gathered in secret in one of their cabins, and they spoke the words Kofi had taught them, the words Elijah had prayed, the words that had emerged from them on that Christmas Eve. They never fully understood why it had happened, why that night, why in that way. But they knew it mattered. They knew it meant something. It was a way of honoring the past, of refusing to let it be erased. Reverend Carver continued to visit them, to offer support, to listen. He never stopped wondering about what had happened, never stopped trying to understand. But over time, he accepted that some mysteries could not be fully solved, that some questions had no clear answers. He wrote about the experience in his private journal, reflecting on what it had taught him about faith, about trauma, about resilience. He wrote about how the seven had been stripped of everything, their freedom, their families, their dignity, yet had found a way to hold on to something that was theirs alone, something that could not be taken. He wrote about how their voices, speaking in a language no one recognized, had been an act of resistance, a refusal to be silenced, a declaration that they were still here, still human, still worthy of being remembered. And he wrote about how that night in the chapel had changed him, challenged his understanding of suffering and redemption, and reminded him that the sacred could appear in the most unexpected places, through the most unexpected voices. The town slowly moved on, as towns always do. The memory of that Christmas Eve faded into rumor and legend. New events, new crises, new concerns took its place. The war drifted further into the past. Reconstruction gave way to new political realities. Life continued, but the mystery never completely vanished. The records remained: Tate's notes, Langford's account, Finch's analysis, Harrow's journal, filed away in archives, libraries, and private collections, waiting to be rediscovered. And the question lingered, perhaps forever unanswered. What truly happened in that chapel on Christmas Eve, 1868? Was it a psychological release, collective trauma finally finding a voice? Was it cultural memory, carried across generations and emerging in a moment of shared consciousness? Or was it something else entirely, something that resisted classification, something that reminded us how little we understand about the human mind, about memory, about the ways the past refuses to remain buried? The seven never spoke of it publicly. They carried it with them, private and sacred, until the ends of their lives. And when they died, Abigail in 1891, Marcus in 1895, Dinah in 1898, Samuel in 1901, Jonah in 1903, Cleo in 1907, they took with them whatever understanding they had gained, whatever truths they held. But the words remained, the sounds remained, the silence that followed remained, mystery remained. And perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps some stories are not meant to be neatly resolved. Some questions are meant to linger, unanswered. Perhaps the value lies not in the solution, but in the asking, not in explanation, but in wonder. What is known is this. On Christmas Eve, 1868, 7 people spoke in a language no one recognized. They spoke in perfect unison, with precision and structure, with intention and meaning. They spoke words passed down to them by a man torn from his homeland, a man who endured unimaginable suffering, a man who refused to let his culture, his language, his identity be erased. They spoke for him. They spoke for Elijah. They spoke for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been forgotten, everyone who had been told their voices did not matter. And in speaking, they ensured those voices would not be forgotten, that those lives would not be erased, that the past would not remain buried. The chapel still stands on Ashley Street in Valdosta, though it has been renovated many times over the years. The pews where the 7 once sat are long gone, replaced by newer ones. The candles have given way to electric lights. The congregation has changed, evolved, become something else entirely. But on quiet nights, when the building is empty and the street outside is still, some say you can still hear it. A faint echo, a whisper, a sound that does not belong to any known language. A reminder that some voices, once raised, can never be fully silenced. A reminder that the past is never truly past. A reminder that we are not forgotten. We are not lost. We are here. If this story moved you, if it made you think, share it. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. And if you want more Mysteries History Try to Forget, subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll be here, uncovering the past, one story a day.